So, fungi, the wonderful world of fungi. So, it gets ever more interesting with more research going on into especially natural ecosystems. So, this was a paper published by Dr. Smart, who works in British Columbia on forested systems there. She has a very interesting research program where she studies primarily Douglas fir forest systems, but there are other species mixed in, including one of her studies was on Douglas fir and paper birches, and how through the use of mycorrhizal fungi, they actually interact with each other, even though they're different tree species, and they actually help each other out during different phases of the year. And so uh, this is one of her publications. She's written a whole book. She's written tons of publications. She has several videos that show up on YouTube and TED Talks that are really, really interesting. And if you have any interested in forest ecosystems, I highly encourage those. This one has a very catchy title. So looking at tree communication, learning, and memory. And that may sound very odd, but when you define learning and memory, plants can do that. And so when I teach my advanced botany classes, we talk about how that occurs. And so she is doing very careful studies where she's showing that the mycorrhizal fungi underground are helping with this process of communication and learning and memory. And one of her probably more famous studies is showing some of the data where she was mapping out the mycorrhizal connections. And the bigger the circle and the darker the circle are primarily older trees that are playing a larger role in the ecosystem, where they're connected to more of the surrounding trees than the others. So the bigger the circle, the darker the circle, more connections with the mycorrhizal fungal network. The smaller the circle, the lighter the green. That means there's fewer connections. And so this was a Douglas fir forest, and Douglas fir forms relationships primarily with ectomycorrhizal fungi, so that's what she was studying. And so they've been mapping this out in different plots out in British Columbia, looking at all the connections. And this does have a lot of implications. She originally studied to be a forester and had that kind of training, but then she's turned her attention more to forest ecology. But she's trying to use this information to inform foresters on how to manage land for harvesting appropriately. And one of her big pushes is to try to convince foresters that the biggest, oldest trees should be saved and not cut down for the lumber. You can see from the forestry perspective, if you're trying to grow trees for profit, the bigger the tree, the more profit, right? She's saying that these older trees, she often refers to them as mother trees or hub trees, that they're vital for the health of the overall forest because of all these connections and the way these older trees help out all the other trees in the area that they're connected to. And so her push is, if you hang on to some of these hub trees, the overall forest health will be better. And in the end, you'll get a more economic gain from that rather than cutting out the big ones and hauling those away. And she's done nice studies to demonstrate this. She's not just saying it, she's got data to back it up. But when they started studying all these mycorrhizal connections and looking at this, they were finding that, some of the more common things that you might think might get passed along the network here, like carbon, nitrogen, water, all of those certainly were being passed through the mycorrhizal network to the different trees in the ecosystem, but also other things that were rather surprising to many, defense molecules. And so it's a way to transmit from one tree to the next, especially so you can imagine one tree getting attacked by an insect pest or something, that they can alert other trees. They can get other trees up and running to defend themselves. They even are showing really nice data that trees can recognize kin and non-kin. And that can have sometimes a difference on how they behave toward those different organisms around them. And so this ability to recognize self versus non-self, kin versus non-kin is becoming, the data is starting to support this more strongly. So some of the other papers that she's published, and some other scientists around the world that have been looking at this, have found they've added to the list of what else can be transmitted through the mycorrhizal network. Phosphorus is a big one. That's over and over. Phosphorus can be very challenging for a plant to get access to. The soil system might have a lot of phosphorus, but it's often complexed or precipitated out, and the roots have a really hard time accessing that. And so they have to rely on fungi and bacteria to help. And mycorrhizal fungi are really good at that. They're really, really good at tapping into that hard to get at phosphorus and making it available to the plant. Allelochemicals, so sometimes you have trees or plants competing with other plants, and they'll use allelochemicals to inhibit the growth of neighbors or kill the growth of neighbors. Genetic material, primarily fungal nuclei, they see actually getting passed into different plants underground. Auxins, which are plant hormones, but this hormone can be, it shows up in the root, and they can see it get into the mycorrhizal fungi and pass to neighboring plants. So the sharing of hormones. Jasmonic acid is another hormone, plant hormone, that can get shared via the mycorrhizal network. There's even some hypotheses that there may be sound that's transferring via the mycorrhizal network that is ecologically meaningful to that ecosystem. And so they're looking at sound as a way of communication through the mycorrhizal network. That one's a little, is still in the hypothesis stage and not quite, they need more data to collect that, but some of the initial data is intriguing. And so basically they're showing that the mycorrhizal network really is helping that ecosystem. There's a lot of cooperation going on essentially with the help of the mycorrhizal network, so that ecosystem stays strong and survives a variety of biotic and abiotic challenges. And they really think that the presence of this mycorrhizal network really is allowing the plants that grow much slower, respond slower in general, but with the help of these mycorrhizae and this underground network, that it really does allow them to respond and adapt a little bit more quickly compared to if they didn't have those partners with them. And so we're finding that to be true with humans too, that our microbiome allows us to adapt to our environment much more easily and readily than if we couldn't exist without a microbiome, we wouldn't survive. So interesting ideas out there. So lots of research going on. It's captured the attention of a lot of scientists, and initially her work was very much scoffed at, I guess. Initially, they didn't quite believe that this was happening and that they could do so much. But the data is pouring in and it's showing it to be true. So the data is very supportive. So I wanted to mention that's a huge part of mycorrhizal research going on right now. And one of the former students from our department ended up going out there and working with her and working on our master's out there. So very interesting work. Okay, another ecological mechanism to think about with fungi is the idea of endophytes. So since I do a lot of research on plants, we'll be kind of focusing on that with fungi. And so fungi can grow, we talked about mycorrhizal fungi that grow on the roots. They can get into the root tissue. They grow off into the soil. Endophytes spend their whole life inside the plant. They don't come off. They don't grow on the surface like the mycorrhizal fungi do. And so endophytes are living in the plant tissue. So they live in between the cells, like in the tissue. They don't live in the cells. They don't do that. They just hang out in the tissue. And so And just remember that bacteria can do this too, but since we're talking about fungi over these several sessions, I'm going to zoom in on fungi. But there's plenty of bacterial endophytes. So, if you think about it, if you're a fungus and you live in a plant, that's a pretty nice habitat. You're sheltered, you have a homeostatic environment, you get nice access to nutrients because the plant will be excreting chemicals from itself that you can pick up and use. And so it's kind of a sweet life to be an endophyte. And then what they're finding is that, similar to the human microbiome, we now know that humans are benefiting tremendously from their microbiome. We're seeing that in the plant world too, that the plants are getting all kinds of benefits. This is just a small list. They see and these are published studies that are showing this idea it can help the plant defend itself against pathogens of all kinds, including herbivores. It can help against abiotic stresses. They're finding the presence of certain fungi are really pivotal for them to adapt to really hot conditions, drought conditions, which, they're suspecting more plants are going to be exposed to with climate change going on. And they've looked at toxins, faulty conditions. So they're looking at a lot of different abiotic stresses and what happens if you knock out key endophytes versus the presence of those endophytes. You can see big differences in the plant's response to these environmental stresses. So they do seem to help the plant just get better nutrition. And they are finding, this is just a short list. This research is really taking off as well, primarily because of the human microbiome funding that's occurred, where there's all kinds of amazing research going on with that. And so a lot of people have turned their attention to plants and asking the same kinds of questions, like, do plants have a microbiome? Of course, the answer is yes. And so now we're trying to figure out all the good things to do. And of course, that's important for us. If you just think about trying to feed, billions of people, understanding this relationship, it could be very important for making sure that we have plants to go around, nice, healthy, and nutritious plants. So they're looking at this idea that endophytes can be, a lot of my research with endophytes is looking at using them as biocontrol agents, but I'm also interested in how they might interact with medicinal plants and how they might alter the secondary metabolite profile. And they're finding that the presence or absence of certain endophytes definitely do impact different secondary metabolites. They've looked at cannabis, both CBD, and there's a little bit of anecdotal with THC production. And so there is this idea that you can use, endophytes can be playing a role of helping defend the plant, but it can also be influencing their secondary metabolite production. And so when they started looking at endophytes, one of the main reasons initially they started looking at endophytes was secondary metabolite production. They were looking for drug discovery. Could we find endophytes that have novel drugs that humans haven't really seen yet that we could use, and for human health, animal health, plant health? And so that was the initial focus. And so those of you who've taken Plant Kingdom class, we talk about Dr. Strobel, who is one of the huge pioneers in endophyte research. And he traveled around the world to go and sample plants and isolate their endophytes and find out what kinds of secondary metabolites they are producing. And he has found many. This was one of his first early ideas. So this chemical that you're seeing here, that's the common name for it, is Taxol. Paclitaxel is really how they refer to it, but that may sound familiar to some of you, and it is a drug, probably $1 billion drug by now, that is incredibly effective against certain types of breast cancer. It can put the patient into remission. So it's super powerful and successful. And so the problem is they found it in the bark of yew trees. Yew trees grow slowly. There's only so many of them in the world. And so they started getting worried because they were cutting down yew trees like crazy to get to the bark and get this drug. And so Dr. Strobel and one of his colleagues up in, I think in Canada, said, I wonder, could it be an endophyte hanging out in the bark of the tree that's actually producing this chemical? And if that's so, it'd be so much easier to just isolate the fungus, get it to produce this chemical, and then we could stop cutting down all the yew trees. So they went and sampled yew trees, the stem bark area, and sure enough, they did find a fungus that this one, Pestalotiopsis microspora, and it does make Taxol. And so it's much easier to work with fungus than the plant because you can grow them in those huge vats, kind of like in the beer brewing industry, those big vats. All you have to do is figure out how to feed it to make it pump out the Taxol, and then you can easily isolate that and purify it. Much more straightforward, less costly, less footprint overall. Do it in small space, and you don't make the yew trees go to extinction. So this is a really interesting fungus too, because it is really easy to manipulate in the lab in terms of getting it to take up DNA. It's like super happy to do that. It's one of the most, they say, easily transformable, which just means it's really easy to get novel DNA into that fungus. And so they're wondering if that endophyte got the genes from the tree and got it into its own repertoire of its DNA, and then it started making Taxol. So the plant can make it, the fungus can make it. They think it's horizontal gene transfer from the yew tree to this fungus. And so very, very interesting. And since then they have found another published study, very famous one, where they were showing how an endophyte in poplar trees was acquiring a key gene necessary for remediation of toluene from another endophyte, a foreign endophyte. And so they're starting to realize that endophytes seem to be pretty open to the idea of getting this novel DNA and then using it for their own purposes. So really interesting. These are some of the fungi that Dr. Strobel has isolated from different plants around the world. And what they're finding in their research is that a lot of these endophytes can produce different compounds of the plant host, just doesn't, which kind of makes sense. If the plant allows the fungus to kind of take over that role of, you make those chemicals and I'll make these chemicals, and together as a team we'll be pretty good. And so they're finding, when they look at these fungi in the lab and start looking at their metabolic profile, they can show that there's all kinds of secondary metabolites that one endophyte can make. So lots of interesting research going on. It does also, it appears to be that this has been occurring since plants evolved. And so this idea that, endophytes were just part of the plant's lifestyle right from the get-go. And so this is a paper that was published trying to get at the idea. 400 million year old plants. So they were looking at fossilized plants and looking inside, and they were finding endophytes. And so the thought is that when plants first evolved, they quickly gained endophytes, and that it's been a long, long partnership and has really helped them survive on the planet and, help adapt to all these different environments. So microbial inheritance. So they're showing that mother plants will pass on their endophytes into the seeds. And they think that that is something that's very advantageous to the seed and the next generation, because it's providing them key endophytes to help them deal with that particular environment that they'll germinate and grow in. And the other idea too is that when endophytes, so once that seed that has the endophytes inside starts to germinate and grow, those endophytes can move through the plant body, right? They can show up in the leaves, they can be in the roots, stem, so they can be mobile and move to different parts of the plant. And then a lot of research going on. with how do endophytes influence secondary metabolite production? And can we understand that to improve, the high value metabolites that humans are interested in? Can we use the endophytes to either augment that or just use the endophytes and not even use the plants? Just grow the endophytes separate. And so a lot of companies are looking at this idea of using endophytes. So if you get into any jobs with, chemical extraction with plants, keep in mind the endophytes might be the ones that are actually influencing or even making the chemical that you're going for. And one of my former students who now works in the indoor egg program, she's a professor over there, she also looked at endophytes with a very rare orchid here in Pictured Rocks, National Lakeshore. Near Munising, we have the largest population of ram's head lady slippers. Beautiful, beautiful lady slippers. For some reason, they like the sand dunes in that area near Pictured Rocks. And it's either endangered or has gone extinct in many regions of the world. And here, there's like over 2 million individuals. So for some reason, they're very, very successful in this area. So one of Dr. Roberta's students was looking at, mapping out where all the ram's heads are, what kind of habitats within microhabitats did it seem to be really enjoying, and just really getting into the ecology. And then Carrie kind of worked hand in hand with that project, looking at could there be something going on with endophytes or something going on in we started initially looking for mycorrhizal fungi too. And then she really zoomed in on the endophytes. So, this idea of the endophyte seems to be involved in helping this particular plant be so successful here, where in other parts of the world, it's really struggling. So lots of interesting ideas for endophytes. That's a very true point. So, for us not to be hungry, naked, and sober, fungi are going to be a big part of producing food for us. And when you think about how they help plants to grow and survive, there's all of that. But then also, that's this idea where you use fungi to augment microbes. And so this is a book cover, Microbiome Stimulants for Crops. And so they're looking at this very heavily. Can we develop a mixture of microbes, including fungi, that can be inoculated into the soil primarily and will help plants thrive? And by the time we harvest them, hopefully have nice, nutritious tissue that we end up eating. So they're certainly looking at that. And it's a huge push in agricultural research. The other idea, though, is to use fungi directly for food. And, that's not a terribly foreign concept. Edible mushrooms, and that's been known. We use fungi in various processes, food production, but now these are some new ideas coming up. Has anyone heard of the Find, Nature's Find company? It's the products, I don't see them on the shelves here. I think they're in bigger cities, and it's because it's so new, but eventually I think they will be here. But they use this particular fungus, Fusarium flavolapis, and it was discovered in Yellowstone National Park. And they brought it back to the lab and isolated it. And when they started looking at it more carefully, that's a picture of it growing in their lab. It looks like a mat of fungal growth. It has a complete protein, which means it has all the essential amino acids that we need in our diet. So it's considered a complete protein. Good source of vitamins, minerals, and fiber. Growing it with our breakthrough fermentation technology uses a fraction of the water, land, and energy compared to traditional protein sources. Phi is the versatile protein the planet needs now. And so this is actually, the business is based in Chicago. And I tried looking up what their breakthrough fermentation technology is, but it's very secret. They don't tell. So you'd have to work there to get the details on that. But basically, um, this is just a wild fungus that they found. And they happened to hit on a gold mine where it is so nutritious for human health. And so they're running with it. And basically, I mean, when you think about growing up fungi, it's not that hard. So their breakthrough technology, I don't know that it's really that breakthrough. I think it's pretty basic. You provide the right humidity, temperature, nutrients, and you can get fungi to grow pretty easily. So look for that on your shelves, grocery shelves, and it's going to be more of a thing. But this is actually they're making products that don't even look like fungi. Like you're not eating like a mat of. It's not like a SCOBY culture or something like that. That's not what they're doing. They're actually turning it into like it looks like cream cheese, and you can like put it onto your bagels and things. I don't know if I have a picture. I think I do. Yeah. So here they're just saying how sustainable it is, which I think is, we very much need this kind of uh, thinking and technology. But here you can see it's cream cheese, but it's fungi. Would you eat that if you eat normal cream cheese? I think it'd be really interesting. So that's what the product looks like. Dairy-free cream cheese. And I've seen them make like sausage patties, they call it, for breakfast patties. So they've done some like beta testing where they put the products out for sale, and they've just been getting snapped up. And so my impression is they can't keep up with demand right now because it's been so. Oh, there's the patty, meatless breakfast patty. 75%. So really curious if anyone finds these anywhere, like when you go home too, and shoot me an email. I'd be very, very curious to see if they're making it more regularly out onto the shelves. But I'm guessing their breakthrough technology is similar to this idea where you grow the fungi usually in large shelving units and stack them so it really saves a lot of space, and you're not using agricultural land. It's all indoors. So you also have a lot of control on any kind of other organisms that might want to get in there and attack them and eat them. You can have a lot more control on that, of course. Robert Downey Jr. has been very interested in this, and others. So this one, he's back in the Atlas Food Company, which is different than plant-based meat. So while many alternative protein products have a long list of ingredients, My Bacon has only 6: mycelium, coconut oil, cane sugar, sea salt, smoke flavors, and beet juice. But again, it's fungal mycelium. And they're claiming it's like bacon. Oh, that one. Would you try that one? I'd definitely try that one. So they're getting some backing from some big name people. This is local, Myconaut. Some of you may know Ryan or Joe. Joe Lane graduated with a bachelor's in biology from NMU. And they have formed the Myconaut company. And this is something that is growing. Their business is growing. They're looking at edible fungi, but they're also looking at using fungi for bioremediation of contaminated sites, mainly looking at PFAS. Have you all heard of PFAS contamination? So it is, I just read an article that there's a company in Boston, Massachusetts that had to shut down their water. They sell bottled water, and it tested positive for PFAS. And so they had to recall all of that, shut down their plant to deal with that. PFAS is not something you want in your drinking water or food. Very, very challenging to clean it up. And they're looking at fungi. If anyone can do it, fungi can. And so they're using fungi to try to tackle this problem. And so they're trying to get funding through the National Science Foundation for this. So And we're also working, that's Ryan giving a talk down in, I think it was Chicago, and they won the pitch prize. Kind of like, giving an elevator talk of what you're doing. The 5-minute talk. So they won the pitch prize. The audience voted them top. And so I think you may hear more about them if you haven't already. The Indoor Egg Program is partnering with them because we're very interested in developing the idea of growing fungi for production scale. So we're hoping to do this kind of thing down in the Jacobetti labs. So we're working with them on that project. So I think there's a lot more to this you're going to see in the future. With fungi ending up in our food, then you might not even know that it's fungi that you're eating because it's not going to look like a mushroom on your pizza, for example. And then this paper came out not too long ago. So this, I really thought I gave them a lot of credit for how they're looking at how do we produce food, how do we sequester carbon, and how do we do it without creating more issues to our environment. Keep biodiversity up and conservation of the current environment. So they're actually looking at forested systems. So the target, their food is this mycorrhizal fungus, an ectomycorrhizal fungus, but it's used for food production. And so they are looking at using forested systems, and rather than trying to cut the forest down and somehow grow, what they're doing is they're looking at using current systems, inoculating this fungus into these systems so that it really does develop at higher numbers. And then what they're showing, at least with the data, really pretty fungus, that blue color is all natural. EMF is ectomycorrhizal fungi. It has a protein production exceeding that of like if you grow beef, it has higher protein levels than if you do a comparable beef growth operation. In contrast to commercial ag, cultivating this fungus may enhance biodiversity, contribute to conservational goals, create a net sink of greenhouse gases because fungi are really good at sequestering carbon, while at the same time producing a similar or higher level of protein per unit area than common ag, where you cut down all the trees and put cattle there. And so they're trying to show that with the use of these fungi in a more thoughtful way, the title really kind of says it all, where they're trying to look at how do we produce food, how do we produce carbon, not create more issues in terms of environmental degradation. And so I think there's a lot of potential there in this use of fungi too. Okay. All right, so look for fungi. You're going to see more and more of them showing up. But I have to turn my attention away from that now, unfortunately. I could go on and on, but I won't. I'll refrain. We will get into the next topic. So the next topic is looking at viruses. Okay, so in this section with the viruses, I'm going to get into basic viral biology, viral ecology, but I'm not really going to focus on like COVID, things like that. I think most of us have had it up to here with hearing about COVID, at least I have. So if you want to talk to me separately about COVID, I'm happy to do so, but I'm not going to get into any details of that particular virus. I'm more actually just like, what are viruses? How do they behave in general? And then I'm going to focus on the good viruses. Believe it or not, there's plenty of good viruses out there. And so I want to bring that out because I think we're so inundated with viruses that don't do such good things for us. And I want to show you that there's another side to viruses that most people have no clue about. And of course, it doesn't get talked about in the media because they want to sensationalize how evil viruses are. So yes, certainly viruses have caused human suffering, no doubt, and they continue to do so, and they always will do so. But and so this is showing you some examples. But traditionally, actually, the very first virus that was heavily studied was the tobacco mosaic virus that causes diseases in tobacco plants. And so that one was probably the most heavily studied virus initially, till not too long ago, actually. Then I think HIV surpassed it very quickly. But here you're just seeing some different views. And now if you want to look at a virus, you have to use an electron microscope, which is super expensive. When I was a postdoc, there was a plant pathologist down the hall who he was studying viral diseases of plants. And he had an electron microscope, but he was the only person I knew in that whole university that had an electron microscope. So most scientists, if asked the question, are viruses alive? Most would say no, including me. That's my vote. Although some people say they're on the edge of life. And I'll explain a little bit more about that when we get more into viral ecology. So when you think about viruses, they're called intracellular parasites. So now we are actually talking about an entity that can get into the cytoplasm of cells and is very good at it. They can exist outside the cell, certainly, but they don't do anything. Like they just kind of sit there. They're waiting to get into a host. So the viruses are often called virions. A lot of virologists tend to use that phrase. They'll say virion. I tend to say virus particle. That's what I learned, and so I kind of stick with that. But either word is okay. If they exist outside and are just like on a counter somewhere or on your toothbrush or whatever, they're metabolically inert, which just means they're not actively running any kind of process. They're just biding their time, waiting for a host, and it has to be a suitable host. And so once they get into the right host, then they can become active, and their primary goal really is to make more of themselves. Most viruses do not have the necessary genes to do that, or they just would do it on their own without a host. And so they do need the host cell's reproductive machinery. They need the enzymes typically, ribosomes, all of that from the host in order to make more of their nucleic acid, their enzymes, their proteins. They don't carry all that with them. So I think we're all very aware that viruses are tiny. Here they're trying to show a relative scale. The animal cell, they're not even showing the entire animal cell up top. And then the bacterium versus the very funky looking T-even bacteriophage, which looks like a space alien spider. They call it the spaceship. But there are other shapes besides the spaceship shape. Tobacco mosaic is pretty just a spindle. They call it filamentous form. And so some are quite beautiful when you look at them under the microscope. But different shapes. Some are pretty simple. Some are pretty complex, like that spaceship one on the far right there. You're seeing that it's kind of differentiated into different parts of its body, so to speak. And then the lower left one is COVID-19 virus. So, okay, when we look at all the viruses, certain things we can say. They all have a coat. This is made out of protein, and the more scientific term is capsid. So I would actually prefer capsid, that you know it that way. But it's all made out of protein, and it's usually protein subunits that get put together into a certain morphology. And then if you were to peer inside of that, that would be where you find the nucleic acid inside. So far, the viruses that have been discovered, they either have RNA in them for their nucleic acid or they have DNA, but they don't have both. So far, there's not a virus that has both RNA and DNA. It's one or the other. And so when you go to classify viruses, that's like the first thing you do. You just say, is it an RNA virus or is it a DNA virus? And then you classify, start it that way, and then you can do some further classification. So one of the other steps you do right after that is then you ask the question, is it single-stranded or double-stranded nucleic acid? So believe it or not, there's some viruses that have double-stranded RNA. You know, we're so used to thinking that, well, RNA is only single-stranded. That's what you're taught. But viruses can have double-stranded RNA or single-stranded. Viruses can have single-stranded DNA, which is weird, or double-stranded. All right, so that's a further classification. So that's two really big ways of classifying viruses. And then they look at what's inside, what else is inside that capsid. If you crack open the capsid, you're going to find some kind of nucleic acid in there, but you may find some other things too. Certain enzymes that help them survive and attack their host. Lysozyme, neuraminidase, RNA polymerase, reverse transcriptase, and I'll mention some of these in context as we get more into it. But these are enzymes that basically help them either attack and get into the cells or get out of the cells. Okay, and so they can be very important. And then some of them are involved in their nucleic acid replication. Many viruses also have outside their capsid a membrane, a bilayer membrane, especially the ones that attack humans and other animals. But it's an actual lipid bilayer, and they'll tweak it a little bit. They'll put some of their own proteins into it, but basically it's stolen from the host. So when a virus is exiting out of one of your cells, it will take part of your cell membrane and wrap itself with that. I often think of Harry Potter with the invisibility cloak or whatever he called that. That's kind of what I think about, because that's essentially what it's doing. It's surrounding itself with your membrane. So then your body doesn't recognize it's a threat because it looks just like you. Pretty ingenious adaptation. All right, we'll stop there. Thank you for staying a little extra. I appreciate that. And we will get into viruses next week. Have a good weekend.